Well, we have taken a very deep dive, haven't we, Danny?
Yeah.
I mean, we've really gotten detailed on the history here. So, I want to return then to our original threefold pattern that we talked about in the book of Acts, right? Mm-hmm. That the early Christian community gave themselves to the apostles' teaching, the breaking of the bread, and the prayers, right? Now, I think people might find it interesting that in this episode we're going to start talking about the teaching. But why'd we go in this order?
Yeah,
right?
we chose this order because everything is rooted in something that happened for the apostles. There wasn't a prior teaching that they had, and then they went out and used that. Something happened in their lives, and then they began to speak about that. Mm-hmm. And so the prayer life that they had came from the Jews, right? Came from ancient Israel, and they were using the Psalms and the traditional prayer hours, all those things. But then they had the breaking of the bread, and that was their event. That was uniquely Christian.
Yeah.
And that's what they gave to the next generation to use as a foundation for everything that's going to come after.
Yeah, and actually theologians, so people know, they call this the kerygma.
Mm-hmm. A fancy word for a proclamation. Or something that's proclaimed.
Yeah, Greek word. So how to explain that would be it's the original experience of the apostles, what they actually just witnessed, right? And how many times
what just happened?
I know, how many times do you hear the apostles say that too, that we were witnesses, right? And they made us witness, and he made us witnesses. Mm-hmm. That's the kerygma. They're not forming a religion with a set of doctrines that they're going to teach to people. They are literally just something happened, and all of a sudden they're running off and telling people what the heck just happened. Yep. That's the kerygma.
That's the initial proclamation of the gospel is that piece right there.
And
we experience.
And I feel like even when you get later in the church, like 16th century, for instance, when the Protestants and Catholics are going at it, and they're going back into Paul's letters, right? And they're like, faith alone, see, and the doctrine of justification it's like you're missing it. Like, see, that's not treating the text properly, because Paul's not writing out like a dogmatic, treatise. Yeah. He's just telling you what happened exactly and what it means, Mm-hmm. So, I don't think any verse in the New Testament encapsulates the kerygma better than the first letter of St. John. And it's great because it's literally 1 John chapter 1. Verse 1. He doesn't say hi first again. He doesn't say how have you been?
Hey guys, I'm John, and I'd like to say something to you.
Yes. He says this. He says, that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we've seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon and our hands have handled concerning the word of life. He says, that which we have seen and have heard, we declare to you.
And see, that's where the breaking of the bread is. It's the apostles handing off to the church their own kerygmatic experience, something you handle and you see and you touch.
Yeah, and he says, actually, literally the next statement is, so that you also may have fellowship with us.
Wow. And
our fellowship is with the Father and the Son. Yep. That's very interesting. So he's drawing them into, the breaking of the bread, the table of fellowship, the prayers.
Yep. And the teaching comes out of
that's right,
the breaking of the bread.
Yeah, and so that's where now you can go into even even in 2 Peter. Go to 2 Peter, right? And in there he says, "We receive from God, the Father, honor and glory." Right? This voice came down to Jesus from the excellent glory, and he said, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." And listen to what he says. He says, "This voice, we heard it from heaven when we were with him on the holy mount."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an event and it's an experience that they're telling us about. I think of St. Paul in Corinthians. He says that Jesus was raised on the third day, according to the Scriptures. He appeared to Cephas, to Peter. Then he appeared to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom remain until now. They're still alive. He's telling them, go see.
You know them, yeah.
They're here still. Only some of them, he says, have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, to me, as one untimely born. The apostles witnessed something that jarred them and shook them out of their timidity, right? Because we know after Jesus dies, they hide.
Yeah.
They run away. Something shook them to then wake back up. It's interesting. In the first century, we have the Roman writer Tacitus, right?
Yeah.
Tacitus is writing about the early Christians and how Nero persecuted them. And he says something very, very interesting. He says that for temporarily, this movement was put down after Jesus' death. But he says now it's broken out again. It's very, very significant because what he's saying is exactly historically right. Mm-hmm. That this thing was dead in the water.
Yeah.
This movement was dead in the water when Jesus died. Mm-hmm. But the same people who witnessed his death, and this is the significant point, are the same people who are now preaching him again. How? Why? Why is that happening? Some event, some experience occurred that caused the apostles to then say, "Wake up, everybody! This is what just happened among us."
Yeah, this is the greatest proof of Christianity for me, and it always was. And I know that there's a lot of ways that you can defend Christianity and all these different things, but this is the one that has always pierced my heart. Is I read the Bible. I know it's like people don't read the Bible anymore, right? And secularists especially don't read the Bible anymore, and so they just take potshots at Christianity and you're making up your little fables and stories. I'll tell you what, you go and you read the New Testament. You read this, for instance. I was with him on the mountain.
We have such a treasure. No religion in the world has a treasure like this. No. Eyewitnesses telling us that this man rose from the dead.
Yeah, and it doesn't make sense because these eyewitnesses, for all that they probably didn't realize it, but they were writing, when they write these letters, they're writing their last wills and testaments because every single one of them would subsequently willingly have time to consider, but go to their deaths, saying, "I'm sorry. He rose from the dead. Yep. We were with him."
They were stoned for it, crucified upside down for it,
skinned alive, Bartholomew.
Pushed off the parapet, beaten with clubs, everything. I mean, everything you can imagine happened to these early apostles.
Absolutely. I mean, the Apostle Paul, he lists out actually in one of his letters all the things that he went through. He's like, I was stoned, I was shipwrecked, I was this, I was that, and eventually, finally, when he gets to Rome, beheaded. Yeah, I mean, a shame, for
yeah, and so the message of this kerygma, this proclamation, the first teaching of the church is Christ is risen. God raised this man up.
Yes, that's a big point. These little statements, these first statements of the apostles, Jesus is Lord, right? God raised him up. Be baptized. Save yourselves from this wicked and perverse generation. Yeah. These are the things that you'll hear, right, in the book of Acts.
So for our listeners, I'm just going to list out the perfect summaries of the kerygma, right? So you'll find them in Acts 2, verses 14 to 36, Acts 3, 12 to 26, and Acts 10, 34 to verse 43. Mm-hmm. Those three parts in the book of Acts are summaries of the gospel. It's sermons by St. Peter that he gives to the people. And it encapsulates everything that we're speaking of, the kerygma. He's mentioning the resurrection, the raising up of this man, Jesus, the righteous one.
That's right. And it's not just something new that they're saying. They're even, the way that they're using the quote-unquote Old Testament is different. Mm-hmm. But it's not in like a theological way. It's not like they're like, okay, they put on their glasses one day, they're like, okay, now let's go back and look at this.
See.
Right?
Yeah.
It's just naturally flowing out of them that all of a sudden they're reading the Old Testament different. They're looking at the book of Psalms.
Well, St. Peter is saying, he's now reading the Psalms. He's saying, wait a minute, that's not David. Yeah. This psalm is not, when it says, my Lord said unto my Lord, that's not talking about David. Because you know what?
Yeah.
I know David's tomb is still here with us.
Acts chapter 2.
Yeah. He says David's tomb is still here with us. And by the way, he knows where David's tomb is because that's where the early Christians met.
That's right.
They met in the upper room. Yeah. And right next to the upper room in Jerusalem was David's tomb.
Yeah, actually. So if you can picture this, so you have all these gates that enter into Jerusalem. There was a gate called the Gate of the Essenes. Very interesting, right? The Gate of the Essenes, where the Essenes would come through to like draw water, and that's why Jesus says when he tells them to go find a place to do the Passover, he actually says, "Look for a sign. It'll be a man gathering water." Folks, men in the ancient world didn't gather water unless they were coming from out of town, like an Essene would, to take water back for washings. So he actually situates it right there, and that's actually where the upper room is. It's right next to the Gate of the Essenes, but also right next to that is the tomb of David.
And that's so right. St. Peter in this sermon is saying, I know David didn't rise from the dead because we still have his tomb.
He's right over there.
So these psalms that are speaking of that my Holy One won't see corruption, this refers to Jesus. this is what these Psalms were written for.
That's right.
To point us to Christ.
Yeah, and they're seeing in this original experience of Jesus rising from the dead, and when they're saying God raised him up, they're saying you killed him. You killed him in ignorance,
Yeah.
all right? But God is looking over that ignorance now. He's passing over that ignorance, right? Because he's risen him from the dead to show you that he has accepted the sacrifice.
Exactly. The resurrection is vindication of Jesus' ministry, his life, his passion, everything. The resurrection proves it all, that this was the man. This is the chosen one, the righteous one that we hear about in the servant canticles in Isaiah 53.
That's right.
The righteous one. This is him.
And the apostles, what's genius about this whole process is that, I don't want to say genius because it makes you think if they were sitting and thinking about doing this. It was just, again, naturally happening. They had no other choice but to do what they were doing. It was just a natural reaction. But what was great about it is that they don't leave us with just the message about their charismatic experience with Jesus. They don't just leave us there as like, oh, we had this great experience. Mm-hmm. They bring us into, like St. John says, they bring us into the fellowship with Jesus and the Father, namely by giving us the agape feast.
They bring us into the communion.
They give us our own kerygma. They let us have a kerygma of Jesus, that we now go and we see him in the breaking of the bread. We hear him and we handle him. We handle the word of life itself and we take him into ourselves. And then from there, what do? Same thing. We run out of...
We go out and we say, hey, here's the experience that we've had with the living God.
I know that he is risen. I know that he's risen from the dead. That's right. Yeah. And so that is the church. That will be the perpetual foundation for the church to do quote unquote theology.
Yeah.
To draw, again, and there's no better definition of Christian theology than drawing out the implications of a kerygma. Namely the apostolic kerygma, but then also the ecclesial kerygma of the Mass or of the agape.
And I think it's striking that a lot of times we look at the early apostles and they say things that kind of make us feel like they felt like the end was coming right away. Mm-hmm. In fact, that if we can do this right, if we can live in righteousness, Christ will come sooner, right? But there's this other end of it.
Yeah,
somebody like St. Paul, he says, no, I've just laid a foundation. I've just told you that Christ appeared to me, mm-hmm. and this is what was my experience of him. Mm-hmm. There's going to come others who are going to build upon that.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's 1 Corinthians, right?
Yeah, and I also think of St. John. In St. John's Gospel, it says that Jesus says that the Holy Spirit will come upon you, and it's He who is going to teach you all truth. So, in one sense, the end is imminent, right? Mm-hmm. But in another sense, the apostles know that we've given you our experience, we've shared it with you. Now go out into the world and continue to share it and build upon it. Mm-hmm. That's theology.
Yeah. And again, it makes Christianity different. Every other religion, Islam, all these other religions are starting with like a doctrine, right? And then they're conforming their lives to that doctrine, those teachings, mm-hmm. and they're like trying to convince other people to like believe it, like to trust those teachings. That's not Christianity. Christianity is come and see. Yeah, it's always come and see. Come and
Absolutely.
see. We've found the Messiah, right? So. A great image of this actually is when you walk into a church, a traditional church. I don't know, not one of the spaceships, but if you walk into a church, you look at a rose window. That's it. That's the picture of the history of the church right there in the window. You have in the center is the kerygmatic experience. It's Jesus Pantocrator. Or it's Madonna and Child.
Well, I want to interject there for a second. Jesus Pantocrator. It's great that you mentioned that's the kerygma, because that is the first proclamation of the church. The first proclamation of the church, and what produced the first martyr, Stephen, was because he said, "I see Christ sitting at the right hand of the Father." Yeah. When the apostles said that God raised Jesus up, it says that he sat at the right hand of the Father. This is the earliest seed of the gospel. Mm-hmm. Because you find it not only in the Gospels, you find it in the book of Acts, and you find it in the letters of Paul. Mm-hmm. It's everywhere. It's pervasive. Mm-hmm. That Jesus sits on the right hand of the Father, sits on his throne with authority to judge and make decisions.
That's right.
That's what it looks like. Sometimes maybe we think of the heavenly liturgy as Jesus kind of like a priest with his hands up and facing the Father or something. No, he's sitting.
He's seated.
As the one who makes the decision, because he knows whatever he asks for, the Father will give him.
That's right. Yeah. So that's the foundation that St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians. He's like, I merely laid a foundation, another is coming to build upon it. That's what the church does. The church comes and builds upon the foundation, and that's, again, picture that rose window now going out and creating order. It's like naturally everything starts
not just order, but beauty
and order, and everything starts to fall into place in its proper place around that experience.
Yeah.
Right. So moving from that, then we come to the apostles themselves. Though they know that this work of drawing out the implications of what has just happened to them has the potential within it to divide. And I'm not talking about divide like, Christians from the world. I'm saying internally it can divide the church. And you see this concern really becoming real to them. You see it again. I feel like we quote 1 Corinthians so many times. Like, we
gotta find a different letter.
I
Another
swear
letter
that's
in
not the only thing we read, guys.
Let me see.
But if you look at 1 Corinthians, St. Paul actually begins that by saying, I hear there's factions among you. Some of you are saying I'm of Apollos. Some of you are saying I'm of Cephas. I am of Paul. Another is, trumping all of it. I'm of Christ, They're worried. And then you see in the book of Acts, St. Paul, when he's leaving the elders at Ephesus for the last time, and it's a tearful, they're crying because they're not going to see Paul again. Paul actually says, there's going to be people who come in among you and stir you up.
Yeah. So the church is going to have to decide, the certain things, right? They're going to have to come together and draw out, well, what does this mean when this kerygma leaves a Jewish Christian context? What's it going to mean for the Gentiles? And how do we approach it?
You can see that it's so heavy on their hearts too, because even in the drafting of the Gospel of John, they draw that out too, where Jesus on his last night before he's betrayed, you're like, well, what's he going to say? Like, what does he say? They remembered that, no, Jesus spent a really long time, saying, Father, please, that they may be one as you and I are one. There's a concern cropping up about division, and lo, exactly what you're saying, Dan. Like, as they're trying to, they're now turning away from sort of what they've experienced, and they're looking towards this big old wide world that they're supposed to go get for God. They're seeing that, well, but what do we do about Gentiles though? Like, what do we do? They're not literally, like, they're not Jews, like they're not circumcised. They weren't a part of this story. How do we make Gentiles
them a part of the story? That's what
right?
That's what it is, and that's going to be the rest of the history of the church. How do we make Gentiles a part of this story?
Yeah. I think that's what, and again, when we come to Corinthians, that's what Paul's struggling with the worship. Because the apostles graciously deliver to them their own kerygma of Jesus, but because a lot of them are Gentiles, they're not getting it. They're not getting it the way the apostles got it. And so that's why you start to see this sort of their teaching. But then you see the apostles themselves start to disagree about some of the implications.
Yep.
It's very interesting. So I think that's a good setup, I guess, right? That's a good setup for the next episode. In the next episode, what we're going to do is we're going to analyze the church's first debate. When the apostles themselves, having this common experience of Jesus, and now have to answer a question about what do we do with Gentiles, they actually start splitting into factions themselves, the apostles.
Yep.
And
again, it speaks to the point. This is real life, folks.
Exactly.
This is real life. This happened.
Right. Yeah. It takes away any of the the romanticism. Exactly. Like, as a Protestant myself, when I was first really diving into the Bible and diving into the history of the church, this was something that really got me when I saw that, wait a minute, the apostles themselves are fighting about the implications of this thing that happened, right? So how are they going to settle the question?
Right.
Because that's a pertinent question for us, for Catholics and for Protestants.
Because if you're going to say, when we start talking about the teaching, you also have to start talking about authority.
Yeah. How are they going to settle the question? Exactly.